Millions of fans watched the Raiders move to Los Angeles in 1982, trading Oakland's blue-collar grit for Hollywood's spotlight without ever losing the outlaw identity that made them famous. Two Super Bowl titles followed, built on cast-offs, renegades, and one owner who ran the franchise like a personal kingdom. But the move west came with its own bill. A career-ending injury suffered in a single tackle. A feud so bitter it lasted 3 decades. A death during what should have been a routine surgery. This is where the Los Angeles Raiders' renegade era really ended up. One is the two-sport phenomenon whose NFL career lasted only 4 seasons before a single tackle ended it in an instant, taking a piece of baseball history down with it. Bo Jackson rushed for 2,782 yards in just 38 games for the Raiders between 1987 and 1990, splitting his year between football and Major League Baseball's Kansas City Royals, and becoming the only athlete in history named an All-Star in both sports simultaneously. Born in Bessemer, Alabama in 1962, Jackson won the 1985 Heisman Trophy at Auburn before turning the NFL draft on its head, refusing to sign with Tampa Bay after they took him first overall and instead choosing baseball, only for the Raiders to gamble a 7th-round pick on him a year later and get the deal of the decade. On January 13, 1991, in an AFC divisional playoff game against the Cincinnati Bengals, Jackson was tackled from behind after a 34-yard run and felt his hip pop out of its socket, a dislocation so severe that doctors later said it was physically impossible for him to have popped it back into place himself, though he insisted he had. The injury developed into a vascular necrosis, a bone disease that cut off blood flow to his hip and ended his NFL career at just 28 years old. Before he'd ever gotten to play in a Pro Bowl, he'd already been selected to. He received an artificial hip in 1992 and remarkably returned to professional baseball a year later, becoming the first professional athlete in history to compete with a prosthetic hip, hitting a home run in his very first at-bat back. He is alive today, in his early 60s, remembered as much for the Bo Knows campaign that made him a cultural phenomenon as for what he actually accomplished on the field before it all ended. Bo Jackson was, for 4 seasons, the most explosive and unpredictable athlete in either sport he touched. Bo Jackson's career ended not with age or decline, but with a single freak injury at 28, cutting off what almost everyone who watched him believed could have been the greatest career professional football had ever seen. 2 is the tight end who caught more passes than any player at his position during the 1980s, and whose death decades later traced back to a single surgical mistake he'd been quietly living with the consequences of for years. Todd Christensen led the entire NFL in receptions twice, in 1983 and 1986, setting tight end records both seasons and winning 2 Super Bowls with the Raiders across a 10-year career. Born in Bellefonte, Pennsylvania in 1956 and raised in Eugene, Oregon, Christensen was drafted as a running back by Dallas in 1978, cut before he ever played a down, and picked up by the Raiders, who converted him to tight end and watched him become one of the most productive pass catchers of his era. A devout Mormon who neither drank nor smoked, Christensen retired in 1988 and moved almost immediately into broadcasting, working NFL games for NBC before spending his final years calling college football for CBS, Sports Network, and the Mountain West Conference. His health, however, had been quietly compromised for decades. Family members later said his liver problems traced back roughly 25 years to a botched gallbladder operation that had gone wrong. On November 13, 2013, Todd Christensen died at Intermountain Medical Center in Utah during complications from liver transplant surgery. He was 57. Christensen set records that stood as the standard for pass-catching tight ends for years after he retired. Todd Christensen carried the consequences of one bad operation quietly for a quarter of a century before a second surgery, meant to finally fix it, took his life instead. If Christensen's story is the one that surprised you, Hit subscribe because the next man on this list spent nearly 3 decades locked in a feud with his own team's owner before finally making peace with a flame. 3 is the running back who won a Super Bowl and an NFL MVP award in Los Angeles, only to spend the second half of his career fighting the very owner who once drafted him. Marcus Allen won Super Bowl 18 MVP honors and the 1985 NFL Most Valuable Player Award, becoming the first player in NFL history to record 10,000 rushing yards and 5,000 receiving yards in a career. Born in San Diego in 1960, Allen won the Heisman Trophy at USC in 1981 before the Raiders made him their first-round pick the following year. And by the mid-1980s, he was the most complete offensive weapon in football. His relationship with owner Al Davis soured badly after Allen's early success, worsened by his refusal to cross the picket line during the players' strike and by frequent contract holdouts that Davis reportedly took as personal betrayals. Davis was said to have called Allen a cancer on the team and once told him directly that he intended to get him. Allen's production collapsed accordingly, buried behind an ever-rotating cast of running backs including Bo Jackson, Roger Craig, and Eric Dickerson that Davis brought in seemingly to spite him, never rushing for more than 831 yards in any of his final 7 seasons in Los Angeles, despite still being one of the best backs in football. He left for the rival Kansas City Chiefs after the 1992 season and immediately found the redemption Davis had denied him, winning AP Comeback Player of the Year in 1993 and going 9-1 against his old team over the rest of his career. Allen was inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame in 2003. The feud finally thawed in September of 2012, nearly a year after Davis's death, when Allen returned to Oakland to light the eternal flame, honoring his former owner in a symbolic gesture of reconciliation. He is alive today in his mid-60s, a Hall of Famer who has said he never once tried to get back at the organization that once tried to bury him. Allen was, by his own general manager's account, the single best player to ever wear a Raiders uniform. Marcus Allen spent 3 decades locked out of the good graces of the man who drafted him and needed that same man to die before either of them could finally let it go. 4 is the quarterback who grew up guiding his blind parents through their own home before he ever learned to guide an NFL offense, and whose Hall of Fame case still hasn't closed more than 4 decades later. Jim Plunkett won a Super Bowl MVP award and led the Raiders to victory in Super Bowl 15 and Super Bowl 18, becoming the only eligible quarterback in NFL history to start and win 2 Super Bowls without being inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame. Born in San Jose, California in 1947 to Mexican-American parents who were both completely blind, his father a legally blind newsstand vendor and his mother fully without sight, Plunkett grew up doing odd jobs to help support the family and chose to attend nearby Stanford specifically so he could remain close to them, winning the Heisman Trophy there in 1970, despite a college surgery to remove what doctors initially feared was a malignant tumor. Drafted first overall by the New England Patriots in 1971, Plunkett struggled through disappointing stints in New England and San Francisco before Raiders owner Al Davis signed him as a 30-year-old backup in 1978, a move that looked like the end of a once promising career. After starter Dan Pastorini broke his leg early in the 1980 season, Plunkett took over, won 9 of his final 11 starts, and carried the Raiders all the way to a championship, one of the most complete redemption stories in NFL history. He played until 1986 and has spent his retirement largely out of football entirely, showing no interest in coaching. In February of 2026, Plunkett was named among the inaugural class of the Hispanic Football Hall of Fame, one more honor arriving decades after his playing days, while the Pro Football Hall of Fame in Canton continues to pass him over. He is alive today, in his late 70s, living in Atherton, California, still hoping the same committee that has repeatedly denied him will one day change its mind. Plunkett authored one of the great forgotten redemption stories in NFL history. Jim Plunkett has spent more than 4 decades waiting for professional football's ultimate honor to catch up to a childhood that already asked more of him than most Hall of Famers ever had to give. 5 is the defensive end whose 13-year career transitioned into broadcasting so seamlessly that most football fans under the age of 40 know him only as a television analyst. Howie Long earned 8 Pro Bowl selections and was named NFL Defensive Lineman of the Year in 1985, anchoring the Raiders' defensive line through their 1984 Super Bowl championship and building a reputation as one of the most disruptive pass rushers of his generation. Born in Somerville, Massachusetts in 1960 and raised largely by his grandparents after his father's early death, Long was a relatively unheralded second-round pick out of Villanova in 1981, who developed into a first-ballot Hall of Famer, inducted in 2000. He retired after the 1993 season and almost without pause, joined Fox Sports as a studio analyst for the network's brand-new NFL pregame show in 1994, a role he has now held for more than 3 decades, alongside names like Terry Bradshaw and Jimmy Johnson, winning a Sports Emmy for Outstanding Studio Analyst along the way. He built a second parallel career as an actor, appearing in films including Broken Arrow and Firestorm, and raised 2 sons, Chris and Kyle, who both went on to their own NFL careers before joining sports media themselves. He is alive today, in his mid-60s, still appearing weekly on Fox NFL Sunday, one of the rare members of this era's Raiders roster whose second act never required any kind of comeback or reconciliation at all. Long terrorized opposing quarterbacks for 13 seasons using pure disciplined violence. Howie Long simply walked from one Hall of Fame career directly into a second one, without ever losing a step in either direction. If you've made it this far, hit subscribe, because the last name on this list is the man who assembled every single player on it in the first place. 6 is the owner whose just-win-baby philosophy built 3 Super Bowl championships out of cast-offs and troublemakers other franchises had already given up on, and whose fierce controlling grip on the organization defined nearly every relationship on this list, for better and for worse. Al Davis served as the Raiders' principal owner for 39 years, first taking over as head coach in 1963 at age 33, later serving as commissioner of the rival American Football League, and eventually assuming full control of the franchise by the mid-1970s. Born in Brockton, Massachusetts in 1929 and raised in Brooklyn, Davis built a reputation as one of the most controversial figures in the sport's history, moving the franchise from Oakland to Los Angeles in 1980 over the league's objections and successfully suing for the right to do it, then moving the team back to Oakland 15 years later in an equally combative legal battle. His personnel philosophy defined the Raiders' entire identity. He specifically sought out players other teams considered too difficult, too old, or too much trouble, transforming that reputation into 3 championships across the 1970s and 1980s. He hired Art Shell in 1989 as the modern NFL's first black head coach, one of several boundary-breaking decisions buried underneath his reputation as a bully and a lying creep, in the words of one fellow owner. Al Davis died at his home in Oakland on October 8, 2011, at age 82. The cause never publicly disclosed. The Raiders wore a simple helmet decal reading Al that same week and beat the Houston Texans, a win his players said felt like exactly what he would have wanted. Davis built an organization defined entirely in his own uncompromising image for nearly 4 decades. Al Davis assembled every renegade on this list, feuded with more than one of them for the rest of his life, and still somehow remained the single gravitational force the entire Raiders' identity of this era continued to orbit even after he was gone. They rest now in an Oakland home where a franchise's most controversial architect simply stopped one Saturday morning, and in a Utah hospital where a botched surgery from decades earlier finally caught up with the man it had been quietly killing all along. 3 are still alive today, 1 still explaining football to millions of Sunday viewers, 1 still waiting for Canton to finally call, and 1 still living with the hip that ended the most electric athletic career 2 sports had ever shared. The Raiders' move to Los Angeles was supposed to be about reinvention, And 40 years later, the real story turned out to be about exactly how much the outlaw identity the franchise built its name on ultimately cost the men who wore it.